And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demho, and this is 10 nasty cards that I actually like in the Commander format. And this is going to be a contentious issue, I believe. I'm probably going to have a lot of people in the comments telling me that I'm crazy, that I actually like these cards, or that I definitely don't mind seeing them in a Commander game, right? These are cards that a lot of them, I think people would just scoop if they saw them played in a Commander game. They might say that they're not casual at all. I'm just going to make a case for it, all right? For me personally, I'm not saying that I would necessarily play them, although some of them I definitely do. More importantly though, I like to not be a hypocrite, and I'm okay with my opponents playing them, right? These cards that I'm mentioning on this list, if any of my opponents played these cards, even though it might turn the game into a little bit of an unfun situation for me, I actually would be okay with my opponents playing any of the cards on this list. And I'm going to try to make a case why some of these cards actually can be fun, even though they really don't seem like it. So I'm going to start off with a couple honorable mentions in Hall of Gemstone and Blood Moon. Now, of course, Blood Moon, everyone is very familiar with, right? Turns non-basic lands into mountains. Hall of Gemstone may be a little bit less, even though it is a very similar effect. 1 green, World Enchantment. I've mentioned this card a few times on my channel already. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player chooses a color until end of turn. Lands tap for mana, produced by mana of the chosen color instead of any other color. So even though these cards are a little bit different, they are very similar, I find, in what they are doing, which mostly is going to be hating on multicolored decks, right? Both of these cards against a monocolored deck are really not going to do a whole lot. Even a 2-color deck is probably going to be pretty okay with either of these cards. Once you start getting up into the 3 and 4 and 5 colors, that's where these are really going to start to hurt your opponents. And I guess that's probably why I like them, because I don't play 3 and 4 and 5 color decks. Blood Moon obviously is going to hate on the non-basic lands, which typically a deck with more colors is going to be hurt by. And Hall of Gemstone, obviously for the same reason, because you can only choose one color to play during your turn, is going to hurt a deck that wants to play lots of colors. It's not going to completely lock you down though. I think these are both very casual cards that I think we're all familiar with in the format. I know a lot of people don't like Blood Moon, but I think it's very necessary to have cards like that so that it will slow down the person that wants to put lots of, dual lands and triomes in their deck. They have to worry about it at the very least. I think that if you don't have cards like this, and again, a lot of the other cards on this list as well, if they don't exist at all, then your opponents just don't have to build around them. And I think having to build around situations like that is really important with regards to deck building. If your opponents never have to worry about these situations, then it just kind of doesn't hold them back at all, and they can just go completely nuts. So I like these cards in the format, and I've used them both on several occasions. Getting to the list though, coming in at number 10, and Zeron Runes. And interestingly enough, a little bit of trivia here, this is the first card I ever mentioned in my 10 cards you should be putting in your Commander deck video. This is the very first episode, very first card I talked about, because I thought it was actually a really great card to put in a lot of decks. 2 red enchantment. As in Zeron Rune enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Creatures of the chosen type don't untap during their controller's untap step. That can be really great in a lot of scenarios. Obviously against a tribal deck, it is really going to shut them down. Now, there is the feel bad situation where maybe my opponent is playing a goblin tribal deck. They're in mono red, which obviously can't deal with enchantments very well. Maybe they're playing that Cranko deck. So I don't know how many people are going to feel bad about the Cranko deck, but this can really screw them. Obviously, it will tap down their commander if you name goblins. All their goblins will be able to swing once, but then they'll be tapped down and they won't untap. They might not be able to deal with it at all. You can get into situations like that where it kind of feels bad for that one guy. You don't have to name goblins, but if you're in a situation where they're about to run you over and they're dominating the game, I wouldn't feel bad at all about playing this and naming goblins. Also though, it can be really good for even just tapping down your opponent's commander, right? If your opponent has a commander that is really powerful, or that is maybe Voltron, it's really punishing you, you just name whatever that creature type is. Hopefully it's not hitting any of your creatures, and you can just tap down their commander so they can't use it. I think it's a really good card, even though it does feel like a kind of a Staxy piece, right? And there is a lot of cards on this list that are very Staxy in nature. Arena of the Ancients is another one that is feeling very Staxy, very similar. 3 mana artifact, legendary creatures don't untap during during their controller's untap step, and when it enters the battlefield, you tap all legendary creatures. So of course, this is going to tap your commander as well if it happens to be in play, or any other legendary creatures. But again, I think this is a great fit where maybe I have a commander that I don't care if it's tapped. I have a static ability on it. You know, I'm not going to be attacking with it. I'm not going to be blocking with it. I'm not going to be using a tap ability. So if my commander just remains tapped for the whole game, I don't care, because I'm more concerned about the static ability, and it can probably screw over a lot of your opponents, or at the very least slow them down. I mean, it's an artifact. It's pretty easy to get off the table. So I don't know how many people would have an issue with this. I think it's pretty tame, to be quite honest, and I think it can fit really nicely in a few decks. Coming in at number 8, we got Wave of Vitriol, 5 green sorcery. Each player sacrifices all artifacts, enchantments, and non-basic lands they control. For each land sacrificed this way, its controller may search their library for a basic land card and put it on the battlefield tapped. Then they shuffle their library. And for a guy who really likes removal, as soon as I saw this card, I was like, wow, that's amazing. I started putting it in all my decks to deal with all of the 5-color decks that I was playing against, because again, it will hate on those decks more, right? You are getting basic lands, right? I know people don't like mass land destruction, but this is not going to hurt that many people. It's going to sort of hurt the 5-color deck, or anyone that doesn't put a lot of basic lands in their deck. Again, the fact that this card exists is going to maybe force your opponents to have to put some of those basic lands in their deck, so they're not completely screwed this way. When I used to make 5 and 4-color decks, I would put at least a minimum amount of basic lands in my decks to ensure that I wasn't completely hosed by cards like this, or like Blood Moon, for example. Or even if someone cast a Path to Exile on my creature, I was able to go get a basic land on my deck, right? I think it would be silly to not put any basic lands in your deck. Also, the sacrificing gets around, you know, indestructible and that kind of stuff. Gets all artifacts, all enchantments, and non-basic lands. Just a great removal spell. And I have a feeling it doesn't see a lot of play because people don't like the land destruction part of it. But again, I just think that that's a necessary evil in the format, in my opinion. And I think this is a really great card. I also really love the art on it. Next up at number 7, one of my personal favorites, Crackdown, 2 and a white enchantment. Non-white creatures with power 3 or greater don't untap during their controller's untap step. This has been one of my personal favorites for a while because I play a lot of white decks, and in a mono white deck, this doesn't hurt you at all. And this, to me, maybe this is the tamest of the group. I don't know. It's hard to say sometimes, right? There's a lot of these cards that a lot of people like, they'll freak out because it feels like a stacks piece. It's tapping down their stuff and it doesn't untap. It only hits creatures though, right? Stacks, I think that term gets used incorrectly. I don't think this is a stacks piece at all. I think that stacks typically is going after your mana production more than anything. Not always, but a lot of the times it is resource denial. That is what stacks, sort of the definition is. So I don't consider this a stacks piece at all. Neither do I consider Wave of Vitriol or a lot of these other cards stacks pieces, even though a lot of people probably would consider that to be the case. This is the kind of stuff that white does really, really well, right? And again, I've talked about this before in my What White Does Best video about how white does this kind of thing really, really well, but people avoid those strategies because other people don't like them, so they don't play the cards that make white a better color in the format for that reason. And I understand why, but then you get into the argument where like, okay, well, blue plays counterspells all the time, black plays tutors all the time. There's lots of other colors that are doing things that people don't like. That's always going to be the case. So I think just avoiding cards like this just to make it so that your opponent doesn't get annoyed, I don't know. It's a slippery slope for sure, and you need a delicate balance there. If you are playing a heavy stacks deck, they'll be annoyed when you play Crackdown because it's playing into all the other things you're already doing. You're just piling it on. But if you just have a mono white deck with lots of creatures in it, playing Crackdown so you can tap down your opponent's creatures and get in for damage just seems like a good strategy to me. Getting into the more stacksy stuff, and of course this list is going to get a lot nastier as we get towards the top, and people are going to think I'm crazy for mentioning some of these cards that I'm actually okay with. Balancing Act, 2 white sorcery. Each player chooses a number of permanents they control equal to the number of permanents controlled by the player who controls the fewest, then sacrifices the rest. Each player discards cards the same way. So this card essentially is the fixed version of Balance, and of course Balance is banned in the format, mostly because it's just so cheap, right? Balancing Act costs 4. It's a little bit different because it is permanent and it's not specifically going after lands, and that's why I like this card. I think, you know, if everyone looks at their board and you have a bunch of permanents, I mean, if you got a bunch of treasure tokens lying around, this just makes your opponent get rid of all their treasure tokens, right? It's just going to even things out, and I like that. For all the people that are drawing tons of cards, ramping like crazy, you know, if you have issues with stuff like that, this is the solution. I mean, it just is. I know people aren't going to like it, but if you're sick and tired of playing against your buddies somebody's Tatiova deck where they ramp like crazy, this is the solution to that, right? They got a ton of cards in hand. Now they have to discard down to however many cards you have in hand. Now, of course, you can play this the nasty way where you cast a Teferi's Protection and, now your opponents have to sacrifice everything, but you don't do it that way, right? That's the thing. There are nastier ways to play these cards, and then there is the more fair ways to play this card where I'm just throwing a balancing act in my deck because I'm playing a mono white deck and my opponents, they have lots of powerful stuff where they're ramping like crazy and drawing like crazy, and I'm just trying to even the odds a little, right? Your balancing thing, right? It's an appropriately named card that has a very usable effect in a commander game just to sort of even things out. I would be totally okay with my opponents playing this in a commander game, and I've put this in decks before myself. Coming in at number 5, we have Tangle Wire, and again, this is a notoriously sort of stacksy card, and I think because of the reputation of this card, it gets more of a bad name than it should. I really don't think it's that bad. 3 mana artifact has fading 4, which of course means it enters the battlefield with 4 fade counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a fade counter from it. If you can't, you sacrifice it. Also, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player taps an untapped artifact, creature, or land they control for each fade counter on Tangle Wire. So the reason this card is way better than it seems and is notoriously a sort of stacks piece that has seen a lot of play in a lot of different formats is because of the way it is worded, and both the fading and the at the beginning of upkeep trigger happen at the same time, obviously. And so you can stack the triggers so that you are removing a counter and then the second ability resolves and you don't have to tap down as many things as your opponent. Also, you're playing it and then you're not affected by it at all. So the first time you have to tap stuff, you've already removed a counter. So you're only tapping 3 things. Also, you can tap the Tangle Wire to its own ability. So you're really only tapping 2 things. The first at worst case scenario, whereas your opponents have to tap 4, this goes away. And again, we can get into the nastier scenario where I put this in my proliferate deck, like my Atraxa deck, and I keep proliferating the fade counters and I can tap down on my opponent's stuff. And I guess that's a different scenario. For me, I just see this as a card in a commander game, especially. I'm just slowing my opponents down. That's all I'm doing. I'm slowing the game down. You slow down yourself as well, right? If I play this turn 3, everyone's just going to tap down their stuff for a couple turns. The fade counters do go away. It's just going to slow things down. And again, if you're against that really powerful, fast ramp deck, this is just a way to slow them down so they can't completely go off and you can get to a point where you can catch up to them. I also think it's very usable in a lot of decks as well. I had put this in my Alibu deck because I thought it was a great fit there because you want to be tapping down your stuff. It actually fits, right? So you can be in a scenario where you actually want to be tapping down your stuff. Maybe you're in that Arcellos deck. Again, that might be a good fit there where you want your stuff to be tapped. So I think it's a neat fit there. I think it's a card that I would just have no problem with my opponents playing this at all. I think that people just get a little too sensitive when it comes to having their stuff tapped down. I really don't think this card's that bad. Maybe a little more intense coming in at number 4, and another card that I mentioned on my 10 cards video because I actually think it's really good is Dimensional Breach. 5 white sorcery. Exile all permanents. For as long as any of those cards remain exiled at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player returns one of the exiled cards they own to the battlefield. I just think this is a really fun card. I know it doesn't seem like it, right? You're exiling all permanents. That probably sets a lot of people off, but it sets everything back to parity. Everyone goes back to the same place. And when I talked about this in my 10 cards video, I mentioned the Great Aurora or Warp World, right? There are cards like that again, a lot of people play in the format that have a very similar effect. And typically with those cards, your opponent is getting a big advantage because they're building around it. Whereas Dimensional Breach, it's really hard to get an actual advantage around this. Again, you could do the Teferi's Protection thing here to get a massive advantage. That's a whole lot of mana though. Now you're up to what? 10 mana. So if you can pull that off, good for you, you win the game. I've played this in a game and I think it's actually fun. Try it. It's almost like a mini game in a way, right? Where you cast this, everyone has to put their stuff off to the side. And then on your upkeep, you look at all your stuff and you're like, okay, well, what do I want to put into play? So you look at your hand, you look at maybe do I want to put a land in play? So maybe I can cast something. Maybe if I got a big creature, like you got to be careful, right? If your opponent has a Vorinclex and you Dimensional Breach, they probably just won the game, right? Because the first thing they're going to do on their upkeep is put that Vorinclex in play. They got a big nasty creature, all their lands tapped for double mana and yours are going to stay tapped down, right? So this is not the kind of card that you just throw out there. You do have to be really careful. And a lot of these cards, in fact, stacks, and I don't know if this is necessarily stacks, but stacks pieces are really difficult to play. I see people play stacks all the time very incorrectly. Again, going back to the Blood Moon, I can't count how many times I've seen the guy throw down the Blood Moon thinking he's screwing all his opponents over, and the mono green deck is just loving it. They're like, that's not hurting me at all. I'm just going to ramp like crazy, put a bunch of forests in play, and it's not going to slow me down a bit, whereas the 3-color deck is getting completely hosed. You actually have to think about it when you play cards like this. They are kind of difficult to play sometimes, and this one in particular, you have to look at what your opponents have and be careful with how you cast this and how you play it out. Look at what you have in your hand, maybe. You have to prepare for it, but I really do think this can be a fun card in a Commander game. Coming in at number 3, a card that can maybe be a little less fun, and I recently mentioned this in my cards that could be banned maybe, right? I talked about land destruction and how once you go down the let's ban Armageddon in the format, okay, well, where do you stop, right? Do you ban a card like this? Keldon Fire Bombers, which is 3 red human soldier 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices all lands they control except for 3. I know a lot of people aren't going to love this card. I get it. People really don't like you going after your lands. Think about it this way though. Who gets hurt by this the most? The deck that gets hurt by this the most is probably the lands deck, right? Like if I'm playing a mono white deck, I probably have a lot of mana rocks. You're going to have your mana rocks. You get to keep 3 lands and then a bunch of mana rocks as well. The green deck is probably not going to have a lot of mana rocks, right? I don't put a lot of mana rocks in my green deck, so they're probably going to get hurt the most by this. So again, if you're in that play group where you have people that like to ramp like crazy, this is an answer for you. They get to keep 3 lands, right? It puts everyone the same. I am totally okay with any balance type of effect that is going to put everyone in the same boat. Do I want to see an Armageddon in a casual game? Probably not. 3 lands should be enough for you to get going though. I mean, you can cast a Kodama's Reach with 3 lands, right? So the ramping deck is probably going to recover really quickly as well. So even though they'll be hurt the most by it, they will probably also recover the fastest. So at the end of the day, I don't even know how much of an advantage it is. Again, you can get into the more nasty scenario where, because this is a creature, you can flicker it or bounce it or whatever and keep casting it over and over and over again. Removal wins games, people, right? Whenever you get into this situation, just get it out of the way. Just remove it, and then that stops them from doing that. And pretty much every removal spell in the entire format is going to cost 3 mana or less. So that should not be an issue. I just think the one shot I play my Keldon Fire Bombers and everyone has to sack down to 3 lands, I don't think that's that bad. I would be okay with an opponent of mine playing this in a casual game. I would. I know people might think that's crazy. I think it's okay. Ending off with some real nasty cards that people are probably going to cringe as soon as they see. At number 2, we got Possessed Portal. 8 mana artifact. If a player would draw a card, that player skips that draw instead. I know that alone is probably having a lot of people go, I would scoop as soon as I saw this card. But then on top of that, at the beginning of each end step, each player sacrifices a permanent unless they discard a card. I recently put this in a deck, an actual discard deck, where I thought it was a good fit because I want to be discarding and it's giving me an advantage, right? I don't have to sacrifice the permanent. I can discard instead. So in a discard theme, it actually kind of fits and gives you an advantage. Same with a sacrifice theme where you want to sacrifice anyway. If you're throwing this card down just to screw everyone over, right? The same goes for any of these cards. And I know people are going to comment below. They're going to be like, oh, I played a game once where a guy just threw this down just to screw everyone over. Okay, well, that's a mentality. That's not a card. That's a mentality, right? If someone wants to cast a Nether Void in a casual game just to make the game unfun, that's not the card. That is the person, right? Don't blame the card for what the person is doing. I think Possessed Portal can be a really good win con in certain decks, right? And most people are okay with that. Most people, when I talked about my most hated strategies video, a lot of people commented, I'm okay with an Armageddon as long as that opponent wins the game pretty quickly. I don't want to just sit there. If you're just destroying all the lands just to screw the game over, that's not cool. But if you have a plan, if you have a win con coming up real quick, and I don't have to just sit there and draw go every single turn, that's okay. And I would say that that would be the case with Possessed Portal, where I play it and I have a game plan. And listen, this is not going to end the game right away, right? Yeah, your opponents aren't drawing, although there are a lot of ways to get cards in your hand that get around this drawing scenario. So again, you could be in a deck where you're not actually drawing cards and it gets around this. That's another great fit for this card. I think this card is a great fit in a lot of decks as a win con where this strategy fits. You know, assuming they have a removal spell in their hand, they can get it off the table right away, and then you just paid 8 mana to sacrifice your own permanent. But if not, the assumption here is this is a win con in your opponent's deck that they're eventually going to win with, right? And I'm totally okay with that. I think most people should be. Keep in mind, as soon as you play this card, you're the archenemy, and you have to know that when you do so. A lot of these cards will turn you into the archenemy, and you have to realize that you are doing so. So your opponents are going to have to figure out a way to kill you before they have to sacrifice all their permanents or discard all the cards. That can be a long time. Again, you have to be really careful. It is very possible that your opponents are going to be able to just straight up kill you before you can ever get to the end of the game with it. I think it's a pretty neat card, and I think it is very build aroundable. But coming in at number 1 is a card that a lot of people are probably going to think I'm crazy about. I actually have mentioned this before in one of my underwhelming commanders video, where I actually thought it was a pretty good fit. I put it in a patron's deck tech as well. They wanted a Myojin of the Cleansing Fire deck, and I thought it was a great fit there. And the reason why is because it is a 2 white sorcery, and each player chooses from among the permanents they control an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, and a land, then sacrifices the rest. And of course, the land part is what really gets people. If this just destroyed all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments, nobody would care. In fact, Cataclysmic Gearhulk does that exact thing, and nobody cares about that card, right? It's the lands that really get people. And I thought this was a fantastic fit in a Myojin of the Cleansing Fire deck as a win con, because you choose obviously your Myojin, which has a counter on it, and then after everything has been sacrificed, you remove the counter to destroy all other creatures. So now you're the only one with the creature. I know that probably doesn't sound fun to a lot of people. I thought it was a really neat win con for a commander that is incredibly underwhelming, and I would be totally okay with that. If my opponent had that deck and did that, I would be like, wow, good for you, buddy. The important thing here is, though, you still have a land, you still have an enchantment, you still have an artifact, right? In that same scenario, if your opponent has a Ghostly Prison, that's the enchantment they choose to keep. Guess what? Now you're screwed, right? If your opponent has a Rhystic Study and they keep that enchantment, you get to pick, right? So you're going to keep your best stuff. You're going to keep your best creature, maybe your commander. You're going to keep your best enchantment, maybe your Rhystic Study or Smothering Tithe. Again, you have to plan around this. This is not the easiest thing in the world. If someone's just going to throw this card out because they just want to screw the game over, that's one thing. But if you're actually playing this strategically, I think it's a pretty good fit in a casual commander game. You can't play this when your opponent has a Smothering Tithe out, or else they're going to take the game over, right? Just like the situation with the Blood Moon in the mono green deck. Your opponent keeps their Smothering Tithe, no one's going to be able to pay for it, and they're going to get treasure tokens like crazy, and they're going to win the game almost guaranteed. You can also respond to this, right? If you have that Voltron commander or some situation where you think you're going to be okay, right? Maybe you got the Ghostly Prison and you don't think anyone's going to pay for it. Your opponent can respond with a Corrosive Grip, get rid of your Ghostly Prison, and that completely foils your plans. So this can completely screw you as well. And I know people will be like, oh, well, and here's one of my least favorite phrases in the game. Oh, you're just dragging the game out. I mean, dragging the game out? Do you not like playing Magic? I don't know. For me, I'm thinking on turn 1, I got 1 land in play and I probably don't have an artifact, enchantment, or creature. That's the game, right? We're playing the game. Dragging the game out to me means you're just not enjoying the game. So I don't know. If I'm having fun and enjoying a casual commander game and someone drags the game out for 5 or 6 more turns, I'm okay with that because I like playing Magic. So why would I want the game to end? I don't know. That's my mentality with it. I mean, I guess if we're talking repeatable board wipes and constantly blowing up all the lands, again, now we're getting into more of a mentality than an individual card. If my opponent is playing that Myojin of the Cleansing Fire deck and this is a win con for them to help close out the game, great. That works for me, right? Maybe they have a Voltron deck and they're going to keep the enchantment and artifact attached to their commander, and then they're just going to sort of one-shot everybody. Who has a problem with that? I don't have a problem with that. I don't know how that's any worse than someone casting an Expropriate or a Craterhoof Behemoth and just ending the game. Might be a little slower, I suppose, but I honestly think that this would be a fun, interesting interaction in a game. Again, you get to choose, right? So everyone's sitting there at the table, you're looking at what your other opponents have, and you're thinking about what they're going to choose, and you're choosing based on what they're choosing. You're looking at your hand. Do I have removal? How am I going to react to this situation? It really makes you think. You know, I know this card just looks like a nasty stacks card, but I think it is a card that's actually going to make all the players at the table think about what direction they're going to go moving forward. I actually like it a lot, and I would have no problem with an opponent casting it in a casual commander game. I know I'm crazy, right? Let me know in the comments below about how crazy I am. And I know a lot of people who have been watching my channel a lot, and I talk about strictly casual commander on my channel and fun, interesting games, and they'll think like, what's this guy talking about? Have I tuned into the wrong channel today? Like, what's going on here? No, I know it seems nuts that as a casual commander player who likes to play long interesting, fun, casual games. Talking about these cards seems like it's way off topic, but no, actually most of these cards are going to increase the game. So now we're in a longer casual game. If you think about it that way, it actually does sort of fit. And again, I think it's kind of interesting. I think with cards like Balancing Act and Cataclysm and Dimensional Breach, you actually do have to put some thought into the choices that you are making, right? Which I think makes for an interesting strategic casual game. But that is all. That is my list of 10 really nasty cards that a lot of people, I'm sure, probably wouldn't want to see in a casual game that I would be totally okay with, in my opinion. Let me know in the comments below if there's any super nasty cards out there that you're totally okay with in a casual game. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.